Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
Hi students, welcome to the session. In this session, we are going to talk about another mode of reproduction, that is sexual reproduction. In the previous sessions, we talked about how is asexual reproduction taking place in plants. Also, we talked about the various methods associated with asexual reproduction. In this session, we are going to talk about sexual reproduction. In this reproduction, formation of seed takes place, right, with the help of gametes, right. Sexual reproduction occurs with the help of male and female gametes, right, which are produced in male reproductive parts and female reproductive parts. If you remember, in the beginning, when we were talking about the different parts of your plant, and we were discussing that which part was vegetative and which part was reproductive. In that, we said that flower was the reproductive part of the plant. In flower, when we are saying that it is the reproductive part, that means the flower contains male reproductive parts, female reproductive parts. Some of the flowers have both male and female, whereas other flowers only have either male reproductive parts or female reproductive parts. So in this session, we are going to discuss about the structure of the male and female reproductive parts of a flower, and also we are going to see that how the formation of seeds and fruits takes place. So basically, we are going to study about the sexual reproduction that occurs in plant. So when we talk about the male and female reproductive parts, so male gamete is produced in the male reproductive parts called as the stamens, and the female gamete is produced in the female reproductive part called as the pistil, right? And we've already studied about the structure of both of these, that is stamen as well as pistil, that what is a stamen and what is a pistil, both of these things we've studied. Now, before we go any further, we are going to perform an activity to observe both of these parts in various flowers. So, what we are going to do is, we are going to take 3 to 4 flowers, in which we will take China rose, we will take petunia flowers, and we will take mustard flowers. Either you can take any 3, or you can take all the 3 if you are able to, if you are able to attain it. And in this, we are going to separate its stamen and pistil. In some flowers, you may find that both stamen and pistil are present, right? Such flowers are called as the bisexual flowers. Whereas some of the flowers do contain only stamen, or they contain only pistil. These kind of flowers are called as the unisexual flowers, right? So there are 2 types. First is the bisexual flowers. So they have both male and female parts, right? When we talk about unisexual flowers, they either have male or female. So only one type is present. So when we talk about the bisexual flowers, the example that we can take is mustard, rose and petunia. These are your bisexual flowers. That means they have both male and female parts in them. When we talk about unisexual flowers, the example is papaya, corn, and cucumber. These are your unisexual flowers. That means they either have a male part or a female part, right? So these are the 2 parts, that is bisexual and unisexual flowers. Now,
sexual reproduction in plants. A flower is the reproductive structure of a plant. A flower commonly has 4 parts arranged in whorls or rings. The parts from the outside are sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. While sepals are usually green, petals are colored and showy. Of these four parts, stamens and carpels are the reproductive parts, as these take part in sexual reproduction. The stamens are the male reproductive part, while the carpel is the female part. A stamen consists of an anther and a stalk called filament. An anther is a swollen structure present on the tip of the filament. The anther produces powdery particles called the pollen grains. Pollen grains contain the male gamete. A carpel consists of a basal swollen portion called the ovary. The ovary continues into a long style and ends in a knob-like part, the stigma. The ovary contains many ovules. The female gamete or egg is present inside the ovule. In many plants, the male and the female parts are present in the same flower. Such flowers are called bisexual. Examples: pea, mustard, sunflower, China rose. In some, the male and the female parts are born in different flowers. Such flowers are called unisexual. Examples: date palm, papaya, mulberry, gourd.
When we talk about the flower, there are two parts of the flower, that is stamen and pistil. Stamen is the male part whereas pistil, this is the female part. Now we've already studied the male part is made up of anther and filament, right? And in this anther there is pollen sac where the growth of pollen grains takes place, right? And on the other hand, over here we have female, where we have stigma, style and ovary, which contains ovule and which contains the female gamete called as the egg, right? So egg is what? It is the female gamete, right? Whereas the pollen grains contain the male gamete, right? So when we say male and female gamete, these are the gametes which fuse together to give rise to a new plant, right? How this happens, we are going to study it in detail. It is important for us to understand that the anther contains pollen sacs, and in pollen sacs pollen grains are grown which contain male gametes, right? On the other hand, we have pistil which contains ovary, and within this ovary we have ovules. The ovules contain the female gamete or egg, right? So it is female gamete or egg, right? And both of these parts are important for the growth of your new plant, right? Because we are talking about sexual reproduction, that is why we are talking about two parents, that is male and female. Now, when we were talking about unisexual and bisexual flowers, we said that the bisexual flowers are the ones which contain both the stamen as well as pistil, as you can see in this example where you can see both the stamen as well as pistil. Like I said, other flowers which are unisexual, they might be present on the same plant, right? Now, in sexual reproduction, when male and female gamete fuse together, male gamete and female gamete fuse together, they form a zygote, right? And this is the beginning of a new life, right? How is this happens and what is a zygote, we are going to study. But for now, it's important for us to understand that male and female gamete fuse together to form a new cell. It's a single cell called as the zygote. Now you might be wondering that how do this male gamete which is present in the pollen grain reach the female gamete which is present inside the ovary and further inside the ovule, right? So for this we are going to talk about each step, how and how each step is taken and it leads to the fusion of the male and the female gamete, right? So the question again is, Bujo wants to know how the male gamete in pollen grain reaches the female gamete present in the ovule. Again, it's a valid question. Like I already told you that male gamete present in anther inside pollen grain, how does it reach the female gamete this present in ovule? The answer to this question is pollination, right? What is pollination and how does this occur? What are the different agents of pollination? Let's understand. So, when we talk about pollination, it is simply the transfer of the male gamete or basically the pollen grains to the female gamete, right, via different agents, right? So, pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the female part, that is the pistil. When we are talking about transference, how does this happen? It can happen through air or insects, right? Insects like bees or butterflies, right? All of these insects are involved in the transfer of pollen grain. Also, animals, small birds like your hummingbird can also transfer pollen grains, right? Now, you might wonder that while the pollen grains are in the air or they are being transferred through insect or animals, whether it is safe or not. So the pollen grains which are present, the speciality of pollen grains is that they are covered with hard or tough covering, right? Hard or tough outer covering, right? So this hard or tough outer covering protects them while they are floating in the air, right? So whenever the pollen grain is in the air, it is saved from the unfavorable conditions by they are protected for this hard and tough outer covering from drying out. Suppose if the temperature is really high, then pollen grains are protected from this outer covering. Because these are light, that's why it is easily carried by air and they can also get stuck on insects, right? So basically when we are talking about the pollination, it is the transference of the pollen grains to the stigma of your flower, that is the female part of the flower, right? So now let's understand the two different types of pollination that occurs. First is self-pollination. As the name suggests, self means within a single flower when the transference occurs from the anther to the stigma, right? So you can see that within the same flower, right? So when the transference occur within the same flower or when the transfer occurs on the plants, on the flowers of the same plant, right? So if there is, say for example, if you are talking about a plant, suppose this is a plant and it has, suppose this is the male flower and over here there is, let's say over here there is the female flower, right, on the same plant. So when the transfer of pollen takes place from this male flower to this female flower, then also the pollination is said to be self-pollination. That means flowers of the same plant, right? So either the transference is occurring within the same flower, that means when it is bisexual, right? So in bisexual, what is happening? From the same anther, it is getting transferred to the stigma of the same flower. When it is unisexual, what is happening? That the male flower is transferring its pollen grain to the female flower within the same plant, right? So both of these conditions are under the category of self-pollination, right? Then there is another type of pollination called as the cross-pollination. In cross-pollination, involvement of two plants is seen, right? So let's say this is plant A and this is plant B. So what happens in cross-pollination is when the pollen grain from the stamen of one flower gets transferred to the pistil of the other flower, that is on the different plant altogether, it is called as cross-pollination. So we can see the cross-pollination occurs between two plants separately, right, of the same species. So if we are talking about China rose, both of the flowers are of China rose only, right? So what is happening over here? That from the anther, the pollen is getting transferred to the other flower that is on the different plant altogether. This kind of transference is called as cross-pollination, right? So these are the two types of pollinations. Now, if you think about it, how does pollination occurs? I've already told you there are different agents which help in the pollination. First of all, the pollination also, because the pollen grains are so light, so from wind also the pollination occurs, and from insects also. Now, at this point, there is a question that needs to be answered, and Bujo wants to know why the flowers are generally so colorful and fragrant. Is it to attract insects? So the answer to this question is yes. Right? So if you look at rose, right, when you smell it, you see that it's quite nice smelling. The flowers are brightly colored, and when I say the nice smell is because of the sweet nectar that is present inside the flower. So because of this bright color and the sweet nectar, insects like honeybee come to the flowers, right? And as you can see over here, this yellow part which you are able to observe, this yellowish part is the pollen grains, right? Mind you, students, that pollen grains are produced in large numbers. The reason is that not necessarily each pollen grain is going to land on a stigma. Some of it may be lost during the transference, right? So as you can see that the pollen grains get stuck to the body of the insect, and when the insect goes to another flower, what will happen, that these pollen grains will fall on the stigma, right? So from the anther, these pollen grains are collected by the insect's body and it gets transferred to the other flower. Many a times this pollen grain might also fall on the same flower's stigma, right? For example, let's say this is the pistil of same flower, and there is anther, right? And this is the anther that is present, right? So if the pollen grain is stuck to the insect, so what will happen when the insect is buzzing around the flower, this pollen grain might simply fall on the same flower's stigma as well, right? So insect is one of the major pollinators of your bees. Specifically, are they can easily transfer the pollen grain from one flower to another, and within the same flower also they perform pollination, right? So in this way we see the importance of pollination and also how the pollination occurs. Now, once the pollination has occurred, that is the male gamete, right? So this is the ovary, this is your pistil, and over here the pollen has reached. Now, once the pollen grain has reached the stigma, then what? Then begins the process of fertilization. So let's see how does this process occur.